I never got into wrestling to be famous. I got in to make money.
There's a story Jim Ross has told more than once. Back when Bill Watts was running WCW, he carried a gun with him, not for show, because of one man, Scott Steiner. Think about that for a second. A promoter, a boss, a man who was supposed to be in charge of the entire locker room, felt the need to arm himself because of one performer under his own roof. Whether it was fully literal or half legend by now, the fact that this story exists and keeps getting repeated by people who were actually there tells you everything you need to know about the man we're talking about today. So what do the legends who shared a locker room with him actually think? Not the character, not Big Poppa Pump, the man. Let's find out. Scott Steiner didn't stumble into wrestling. He was a Big Ten runner-up 3 times at the University of Michigan and an NCAA All-American wrestler before he ever set foot in a professional ring. That amateur background matters. It's the foundation everything else was built on. What makes Steiner unusual is that he basically lived 2 separate Hall of Fame careers inside one body. The first was a pure athlete, half of one of the greatest tag teams professional wrestling has ever produced. The second was a walking headline, a bodybuilder with a microphone who could turn any interview into something unpredictable. 4 world championships, a WWE Hall of Fame induction in 2022, but numbers alone don't explain why legends still talk about him decades later. The stories do. Before the bleached hair and the bulging arms, there was just Ric and Scott Steiner, running through tag teams like nothing could touch them. Pro Wrestling Illustrated and the Wrestling Observer both named the Steiner Brothers Tag Team of the Year twice, in 1990 and again in 1993. That's not a fluke. That's a team other wrestlers genuinely feared getting into the ring with. Old school talent who worked with them describe it simply: when the Steiners threw you, you were going, whether your body agreed with the decision or not. Suplexes weren't just moves, they were a statement. Kevin Nash, years later in a shoot interview, spent real time talking specifically about his matches against Scott Steiner, not in passing, as a subject worth dedicating attention to. That's how you know it left a mark. Nash doesn't talk about just anybody like that. This was Scott Steiner before Big Poppa Pump ever existed. Pure athlete, pure chaos in the good sense. Look at the highlight reels from that era and it still doesn't quite make sense. A man built like a heavyweight bodybuilder, pulling off Frankensteiners, jumping onto an opponent's shoulders and flipping them over in one motion. He's credited as the innovator of that exact move, which the wrestling world now simply calls a Hurricane Rana. Cruiserweights half his size use it today without knowing where it came from. That combination, the size of a powerlifter with the agility of a much smaller man, is what made him nearly impossible to game plan against. Opponents couldn't rely on speed to escape him, and they couldn't rely on strength to overpower him either. He had both. If you want to understand how big the Steiner brothers were in WCW, look at who they were feuding with at their peak: Kevin Nash and Scott Hall, the Outsiders. This wasn't a one-off program. It stretched over a year, running through the height of the Monday Night Wars, title changing hands back and forth between the 2 teams. One of those matches ended with a finish so controversial, it's still debated by wrestling historians today, a screwjob-style conclusion that left fans arguing for weeks. Why does this matter for understanding Scott Steiner specifically? Because it placed him directly across the ring from 2 of the most powerful men backstage in wrestling, at the exact moment WCW was at war with WWE for cultural dominance, and Steiner held his own. That's the context legends remember when his name comes up from that era. This is also the stretch of time where Steiner's reputation as one of the toughest men in the locker room really solidified. It wasn't just about winning matches. It was about how he carried himself against 2 performers who, by that point, were considered untouchable in the eyes of the entire company. He never treated that reputation as intimidating, he treated it as normal. February 1998, Super Brawl 8. Scott Steiner does the unthinkable. He turns on his own brother, his tag team partner of nearly a decade, and joins the NWO. The physical transformation that followed was just as dramatic as the storyline one. Bigger, meaner, a completely different presence. This was the birth of the genetic freak. But here's a detail that rarely gets told. Steiner has said his very first match after the turn was a loss to Lex Luger. And that scared him because in wrestling, losing right after a major character change can bury a performer before they even get started. He later found out, through Sting, that the decision to have him lose came from Hulk Hogan himself, who held real backstage creative influence at the time. That single loss becomes the crack that opens into one of the deepest real-life conflicts of Steiner's career. It's worth pausing on why this detail matters so much to Steiner. In wrestling, a heel turn is supposed to be a fresh start, a chance to build new momentum with a new character. Losing immediately after that turn sends a very different message to the audience and to the locker room, that the turn wasn't fully backed, that the new character might already be considered disposable. For a performer who had spent nearly a decade proving himself as half of a dominant tag team, that first loss as the genetic freak felt like a signal that someone behind the scenes didn't fully believe in him yet. The tension between Scott Steiner and Hulk Hogan didn't stay in the past. It followed both men for decades. Steiner has repeatedly pointed to Hogan's backstage influence in WCW as something that actively worked against him, not just in booking decisions, but in how his push was shaped behind the scenes. What started as creative frustration eventually escalated into something far more personal. In 2015, an incident at a San Jose airport involving Hogan's wife led to Steiner being barred from attending that year's WWE Hall of Fame ceremony. Steiner has always denied the version of events reported at the time, but the fallout was real. He was kept away from an induction weekend that, ironically, celebrated the very business he'd spent his life in. Two men who once stood side by side as members of the same faction, the NWO, ended up as two of the most bitter enemies the business has ever produced. What makes this feud different from most backstage rivalries is how public Steiner kept it. Long after both men had left WCW, long after Hogan had moved through WWE and TNA and back again, Steiner continued bringing him up in interviews, on social media, at conventions. This wasn't a quiet grudge simmering behind closed doors. It played out in full view of the fans for the better part of 2 decades, right up until Hogan's passing. If Hogan represents the feud that built slowly, Ric Flair represents the one that exploded without warning. February 2000. WCW Monday Nitro. Scott Steiner is handed a live microphone and, completely off script, turns his promo into a personal attack on Ric Flair, not the character, the man. It was raw enough, and unscripted enough, that WCW suspended him with pay afterward. According to Arn Anderson, who was close to both men, the real root of the tension traces back nearly a decade earlier, to a January 1991 title match between Flair and Steiner that ended in a time-limit draw. Steiner reportedly believed Flair intentionally made him look bad that night, robbing him of a star-making moment. Flair, for his part, has said he never fully understood why Steiner's resentment ran so deep. 2 separate wars, Hogan and Flair both born from perceived betrayals inside the business, Steiner gave his career to. There's an added layer to the Flair situation that makes it stand apart. Unlike the Hogan feud, which built up gradually through years of behind-the-scenes frustration, the Flair outburst happened live, in real time, with 0 advance notice to the company. Production couldn't cut away fast enough on every broadcast feed. The segment reportedly got pulled from at least one regional airing entirely. That's how far outside the normal boundaries of a wrestling promo it went. It wasn't performance. It was a grievance, finally reaching the surface, live, in front of millions of people. By 2002, Scott Steiner arrives in WWE as Big Poppa Pump, and the company puts him directly in the path of the reigning World Heavyweight Champion Triple H. The feud that followed is remembered for all the wrong reasons: arm wrestling contests, posing competitions, a build so strange that their Royal Rumble 2003 match was later voted one of the worst-worked matches of the year by wrestling media. What made it worse was that the tension didn't stay fictional. For years afterward, Steiner was openly critical of Triple H in interviews, attributing his rival's rise in the business to his marriage into the McMahon family, rather than pure in-ring merit. It wasn't a storyline anymore. It was 2 men who genuinely didn't get along, and everyone watching could tell. Steiner has since suggested that his entire run in WWE suffered from the same pattern he saw with other former WCW stars who who arrived around that time losing program after program to the top homegrown talent, regardless of their standing elsewhere. Whether or not that reading is fair, it explains why the tension with Triple H never felt like ordinary in-ring competition. To Steiner, it represented something bigger about how his generation was treated once they crossed over. Here's the twist nobody saw coming. By the time Scott Steiner walked into the WWE Hall of Fame in 2022, standing beside his brother Ric, he was photographed standing next to Triple H, smiling, at ease, no tension in sight. Steiner has since confirmed publicly that whatever heat existed between him and WWE, and specifically with Triple H, is gone. Years of resentment, arm wrestling promos, and shoot interview shots at each other's careers resolved. Quietly, with time. Not every wrestling feud gets a happy ending outside the ring. This one did. It's a reminder of something bigger about the business itself. So much of what fans see as real hatred between performers is actually shaped by circumstance bookings, politics, timing, egos under pressure. Take away the pressure of active competition. Put both men in the same room decades later as inductees rather than rivals, and what's left is often just mutual respect for having survived the same brutal industry. Not every relationship in Steiner's career was built on conflict. Kurt Angle is proof of that. Both men shared something rare, real amateur wrestling backgrounds. Angle, an Olympic gold medalist. Steiner, a Michigan All-American. That shared foundation created a mutual respect that Angle has spoken about directly. Angle has said Steiner had a habit of ribbing and messing with talent backstage, constantly pulling pranks, but he never did that with Angle, because the respect between them ran too deep for that kind of treatment. Angle has called Steiner an amazing person to be around. It's a small detail, but an important one. After 2 chapters of real feuds, this is the reminder that Scott Steiner wasn't universally difficult, he was selective about who he tested and who he genuinely respected. The two of them went on to share a locker room again years later as part of TNA's Main Event Mafia, a stable built entirely around veteran credibility. Steiner, Angle, Booker T, Kevin Nash, and Sting standing together against a younger generation. Being included in that group at all says something about how the industry's most respected veterans viewed him by that point in his career. Not as a liability, but as someone whose standing had been earned. Nobody understood Scott Steiner better than the man who stood beside him for a decade, his older brother, Ric. Ric has said plainly that his brother never backs down from anyone, for better or worse, even when that stubbornness created real legal headaches over the years. It's the same trait that made the Steiner brothers unstoppable in the ring, just pointed in different directions once Scott went solo. But the most human story in this entire list belongs to the next generation. Bron Breakker, Scott's nephew, has told the story of his first professional match, an independent show where he expected to simply tag along with his uncle for an autograph signing. Halfway through, Scott told him he had a match that night. No warning, no training camp, just watch some videos. You'll figure it out. That match became the foundation of a career that's now thriving in WWE. Breakker has spoken about that night more than once, and it's never framed as reckless, it's framed as a kind of trust. His uncle believed he could figure it out in real time, with no safety net, and he did. That single decision arguably shaped the confidence Breakker carries into every arena today. Today, Bron Breakker is one of WWE's brightest stars, and he doesn't hide where his style comes from. The moves, the intensity, even flashes of promo delivery all trace back to his uncle. Scott Steiner has joked more than once that his nephew steals everything from him, but underneath the joke is real pride. As he's put it himself, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. So when you ask what Scott Steiner's real legacy is, the answer isn't just the championships or the highlight reel suplexes. It's a locker room full of legends who feared him, resented him, respected him, and in at least one case grew up idolizing him enough to build a career in his image. 4 decades later, his name is still the answer to the question nobody expected: who was the toughest person in that room?